But everyone, welcome again to this event tonight focused on how climate risk is financial risk, co-hosted by the Boston University Impact Measurement and Allocation Program and the PRI. I am Susan Murphy. I'm the Executive Director of Boston University's Impact Measurement and Allocation Program. We are a research program on campus that's been around for just over 3 years now, focusing on measures of corporate performance on environmental and social issues for the investment industry in order to help investors better understand how these topics relate to their investment decisions. We seed research projects all around campus and bring that academic work to the investment industry through a series of monthly lunches, as well as an annual workshop each October. So we are excited to partner with PRI on this kind of last minute opportunity this evening, and are excited so many of you were able to join us in person. I will now turn it over to Kimberly Gladman of the PRI, who will introduce our panel. And we'll have a panel discussion for about an hour. This is being recorded and shared online so that those who couldn't make it in person tonight can also hear this. Then we will stop the recording and we will move over to the side here and have some light refreshments and continue the networking and allow you to ask as many questions as you have at that time.
Great, thank you. So we're so happy to be here. Thank you so much, IMAP. Thank you, Susan, everybody. I am honored to introduce our speakers. First of all, we are so happy to have with us David Atkin, PRI CEO. As I think many of you know, the Principles for Responsible Investment is the world's largest organization for responsible investment. We now have over 5,000 asset managers, I was just explaining about PRI. There's almost 5,000 members now, asset managers, asset owners, service providers all around the world. So we have all different geographies, different perspectives on the financial industry. And we send David all around the world and make him talk to lots and lots of people all year long. So he has probably of any of us, right? All of our colleagues are working on this, but he is really the person that speaks to people from so many different perspectives and can really bring a very global perspective to this conversation. So we're so lucky to have him with us. We are also very happy to have Madison Condon with us, who's one of BU's own, a law professor. She has written very comprehensively and extensively on the legal, regulatory, and conceptual aspects of climate and investment. And there's a lot of people working on this, but seriously, her work is, if you need to read like 1 or 2 articles and get up to speed quickly, she is the place to go. Really, really wonderful work. So she has a great understanding of the current state of play on all of these topics and will be able to help us from that legal and regulatory perspective. And we have Rob Fernandez, who heads up ESG research at Breckinridge Capital Advisors. Some people may know, I've been in this field for about almost 20 years, more than 20 years now. And Breckinridge was one of the first on the fixed income side at a time when people really saw more responsible investment happening in equity, not so much in fixed income. Breckinridge was really out there in front. Rob has been involved in a lot of that work and is now, the firm is now a member of the Net Zero Asset Managers. So Rob can give us a great practitioner's perspective. And we have my colleague, Laura Weeks, who came to us after a career in asset management, and she works in our responsible investment ecosystem team in the United States, working with signatories who are in all kinds of different, asset managers, asset owners, different sorts of strategies and asset classes and all kinds of things. So she too has a very broad view, and she'll be moderating. But before we start, I was asked to give you just a few minutes of where are we right now at this moment in terms of climate being understood as financial risk. I'm not going to recap the state of climate science. I think for this audience, we're well aware of the many scientific reports that have come out in the last year about the worsening of the climate crisis, the increasing danger of our reaching catastrophic tipping points, and the terrifying increases we're seeing in death and destruction from extreme weather around the world. I won't do another, doom sort of summary for you. But what we're trying to talk about here is that's going on in reality. Well, what is the financial world and the securities markets? How are they or are they not reflecting that reality and responding to it? And we know that there's a long history of environmental damage being excluded from financial thinking, excluded from securities prices. But I believe that in this respect, we're at a very exciting and interesting moment that may be an inflection point in that regard. And what convinced me that we're really at that moment was Warren Buffett's 2024 letter to shareholders. I don't know if that's a standard reading for anybody, if anybody's had a look at that. But earlier in my career, I spent 7 years at the corporate library, which maybe some are old enough to know that was a governance boutique founded by Nell Minow and Bob Monks that has since been absorbed by MSCI. But Nell Minow, who's a governance expert and has written a lot on corporate governance, was a friend of Buffett's, is a friend of Buffett's. And for years, she would tell us every year stories of her collegial arguments she would have with him about ESG. So Buffett's position was always shareholder primacy. And he said, look, shareholder primacy is the way to go. Investors should just try to make as much profit as you can. And then if you care about social issues or environmental issues, well, then you'll have this profit and you can donate to causes that will help these things you care about. And try as she might, Nell could not get him to listen to arguments that companies should avoid on causing the social or environmental harm that charities then have to remediate. And she could not persuade him to consider any issues of systemic risk. But this year's letter from the Sage of Omaha suggests at least a partial shift in perspective. And shout out to Madison for first pointing that to me. So discussing the risk of wildfires to utilities, to the utility industry in the American West, Buffett suggests that that risk may be so severe that the very existence of investor-owned utilities could be at stake. While this does not apply to Berkshire Hathaway, he writes that in the future, some utilities, quote, might no longer attract the savings of American citizens and will be forced to adopt the public power model, end of quote. To hear this articulated by the man who's arguably the world's most influential fundamental investor, I believe marks an important moment in the mainstreaming of climate financial risk. Now, I should be clear, Buffett does not mention the words climate change, which have become unfortunately politicized in our country. And of course, we know multiple causes contribute to wildfires, but it's well known that climate change is a major contributor to their increasing incidence and destructiveness, and to the industry-altering situation that Buffett describes. The fact that Buffett's comments concern physical risk is also indicative of the moment in which we find ourselves. So as many of you know, for some years, we in the climate professional world have emphasized transition risk. We've been talking about anticipated changes in public policy and consumer demand and saying, well, you know, companies are going to have to adjust. They're going to have to transition to a lower carbon economy. And many of our climate models and things we'll talk about later, very often we assumed, oh, physical risks, the really dramatic physical risks are further out in the future. But in the last few years, policy action has lagged expectations, while extreme weather, sea level rise, and water scarcity have come to the fore much more rapidly than many scientists expected, and certainly than many in industry expected. And they're transforming the whole context in which business operates. So across many industries, we're seeing climate-related supply chain challenges, and many people are seeing the potential for intersecting and overlapping crises that could disrupt the basic functioning of entire economies. It's thus the very underpinnings of the modern securities markets themselves that are at stake, and some of the assumptions under which we've operated, you know, historically, as we say in finance. I always sort of smile. Historically often means since World War II, right? Which, if you've really studied history, is not very long, right? But some of our assumptions, one of them has been the environment is something we don't need to really think about. That can be safely kind of ignored as we're doing our financial calculations. So there are many things we need to do to properly price in the effects of environmental issues and climate change, and that's what our panel is going to talk about. But before we turn to that, I want to talk about some of the positive news and some of, in broad strokes, what is happening in the financial industry. PRI is one of the reasons I love working at PRI is we are such a big tent and we work with a lot of other NGOs. We work with thousands of investors. So we have a really broad view of what is going on. There are several initiatives that are playing really key roles in moving the financial industry to greater awareness. The largest of them is the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, where Breckinridge is one of our signatories. There are now over 315 net zero asset managers around the world. And within a year of signing up to join NZAM, signatories need to disclose interim targets to progress toward net zero management of their portfolios in this decade. So the commitment is by 2050, you'll be at net zero, but you have to come up with, what are you doing now, right? What are you doing in an interim way? And we already have more than 250 who have set targets for really meaningful steps, either at or before 2030. Another key initiative is that of the net zero asset owners, which now includes over 80 institutional investors working toward that same goal of net zero aligned portfolios by 2050. And they also have interim steps. And both alliances, what's really important to know about them is that they are acutely aware of the variation in members' business models, types of beneficiaries, legal jurisdictions that they're operating in. So both provide methodological options and guidance that ensure fiduciary concerns are always paramount, and investors are all crafting their own individual paths to net zero. And there's a lot of, politicization and propaganda. And so I just always want to say that has been every single document, everything these initiatives do is the investors are crafting their own individual paths, but we're facing a common scientific reality. So yes, people come to some similar conclusions about what might be good strategies to do, but it's not because anybody's being dictated to. There's tremendous methodological flexibility by design. Now, both these initiatives are inspiring a collective sharing of awareness, ambition, and best practice that is really changing investment practice in ways that recognize and mitigate climate risk. But we are still just getting started. All of these initiatives have come up, the oldest since 2017. A lot of the action has happened since 2020, these last few years. So we have a lot to do and a lot that needs to accelerate quickly. So we'll now turn to the panel to talk about some of the hurdles that we're facing and what we can do to overcome.
Thank you, Kimberly. So this is Laura, the voice from the side of the room. Hello to anybody that can see my paper online. I'll just be off to the side here. Kimberly was very humble in her introductions. She's one of our climate experts and lives and breathes this work every day. So while oftentimes we'll connect and talk each other off the ledge about the massive problem that exists, it's really exciting to hear the work that's being done. With that, David, I'd love to turn to you from your global perspective. What else might you add to Kimberly's summary?
I could say a lot, but I'd better be careful and not talk too much. The first thing I'd say is that this is still a very young industry. Responsible investment is still a very young industry. And just to sort of segue for a second, but I think it is related. The way I see what we're doing is investors have increasingly recognized that when it comes to understanding risk and opportunity, but also value, what is the value of a company, there is a whole lot of information that is not on the balance sheet that enables them to properly assess risk and opportunity. And I mean, I've always struck by the Ocean Tomo research longitudinal study, which shows that from the 1970s, when you looked at the S&P 500, 80% of the value of that company could be attributed to tangibles and 20% intangibles. That study done now is 10% tangibles and 90% intangibles. And so there's a whole lot of value we are not understanding that our industry, I think, is addressing. What we're doing is we are effectively replumbing finance, and we are providing the tools, the information, the frameworks and the data to be able to properly assess risk and opportunity as it sits on the balance sheet. The problem we have with our industry, though, is that if you think about it, accounting standards have been developed over many, many decades. And our industry's only effectively been around for 20 years. And we don't have a lot of time. These systemic risks are escalating. And so there is a sense of urgency. But I also would say I have real optimism because we are seeing the building blocks being put in place. So just make that comment first. The second point that I would make is that there is no one way to do responsible investment. And certainly we have learned that as we've done a deep consultation with our signatories over the last 18 months. We have signatories in 100 countries, in asset classes, all the asset classes, asset owners, asset managers, et cetera, et cetera. And the thing that came back to us was that there are different ways of being a responsible investor, and we as an organisation need to provide more tailored support. And so as a consequence, we've been designing what we are calling progression pathways. And we will be launching these progression pathways next year. We're co-designing them with signatories. And based on your investment approach, we'll provide programs of support, peer groups you can benchmark yourself against, and you will know the steps that need to be taken for you to go from being an introductory responsible investor to a very advanced one. And in those progression pathways, we'll be addressing thematics around climate change, for example, and we will map the various initiatives that you can undertake to improve your effectiveness as a responsible investor. And so I guess that I think is one of the key things that we think we can provide back to our community, but also reflects the diversity of approach and the fact that everyone has various levers and tools that they can use, but not everyone has the same thing. We need to recognise that.
No one size fits all, but yet all need to cooperate in order to address this significant problem. Kimberly mentioned something about we anticipated the transition risk aspect to be a little bit more near term. However, it seems to be that the physical risk is the thing that we're confronting most directly currently. Madison, can you tell us a little bit, why is physical risk so hard to quantify?
Wow. Well, so there's really a lot to be said about why physical risk is so hard to quantify. So maybe I'll just try to highlight some of the challenges. One is getting physical risk correct requires a tremendous amount of granular asset level data. So if you're trying to assess the physical risk to a company, you need to know where all their factories are. You need to know where their supply chains of those factories are. You need to know a lot of stuff about you, not just projecting from like climate trends from the global climate models, but you need to understand how that will manifest on the ground. So you need stuff like soil type, where's the flood infrastructure, like you need really a ton of granular level data that is not collected in a particularly usable format right now. And there's a major challenge that's happening, and this isn't just a challenge for asset managers and asset owners. This is a challenge that the financial regulators are facing, that economists in general, I think, haven't been doing like a very good job with, which is how to translate the global climate models, the big science models, which were primarily designed to forecast average global temperature rise, and how to translate the data that we get from the big global science models on supercomputers to manifestations on the ground at the local level. And that translation has been pretty rocky, and there needs to be like much more interdisciplinary work about how to bring different types of risk assessment together. And also I'll just highlight one, the big global climate models are broken down into a big grid for a bunch of statistical reasons and science reasons. They're good at forecasting averages. They're not so good at forecasting extremes. They're not good at forecasting extreme heat waves. They're not good at forecasting like complicated extreme events such as cyclones and hurricanes. And that fact is actually often overlooked when economists, for example, macroeconomists, translate the outputs of the GCMs into forecasts of estimated economic impact. So one tool to address that is catastrophe models, which is a tool borrowed from insurance, like much more granular data that uses Monte Carlo simulations to try to get at trying to model the extremes. But it's pretty early days in those tools from the insurance sector, making it into broader areas such as banking or even the Federal Reserve. If you're interested, I'll highlight there was an article that just came out yesterday in risk.net, which is open access, which did, I thought, like a very good job of talking about some of the bad breakdowns in applying top-down models to estimating bottom-up risk. So I would recommend people check that out because there's too much to say really about the challenges of assessing physical risk.
That's really helpful. I'd like to come back to models in a little bit. We've heard a little bit about the data, the research. How do you quantify it? Rob, how do you implement that? How do you implement addressing physical risk in bond portfolios?
Great conversation so far. I mean, really interesting. I guess at Breckinridge Capital Advisors, maybe just at a high level, I could mention that we're based here in Boston, not far. We manage about 49 billion in assets in total. We started integrating ESG considerations into our corporate and municipal research process in late 2010, 2011. We're a proud PRI signatory since 2012. Working on the assessment right now. It's going okay, I think. Let's see. It's due soon, I know. So it's really been a kind of iterative process. The way we've looked at ESG considerations in municipal bonds specifically has certainly matured a lot. Basically, what we do is that we broke down the municipal space, all the different issuers of municipal bonds into kind of 10 key sectors. And then from there, we look to source environmental social that was most applicable for each sector. So for example, we're looking at ESG risks for cities and counties, states, water systems, school districts. And so in terms of bringing in physical climate risk into our models, we've done that across all 10 sectors. And we're sourcing the climate data from a third party. We're sourcing the climate data from a third party. It was a Boston-based firm called RISQ, R-I-S-Q. It's Intercontinental Exchange, ICE. They've done a great job in using information, variety of data sets to identify including extreme rainfalls, events, drought risk, hurricane risk. So this is across the 10 sectors. And it's essentially an adjustment that's made to our score. And it's systems. Analyst that's looking at like the city of Boston can quite easily see, what the climate risk, the physical climate risk looks like, and the impact on the score. And that score, it gets brought into the analyst sustainability assessment for the municipality. Bringing in that risk data, a few analysts on our municipal team spent a lot of time working with risk a few years ago and kind of partnered, form them, what investors would need. And it's been definitely, very productive for us. And so that was certainly nice enhancement for us.
Great to be able to bring the theory to the practice. Perhaps maybe one more question on physical risk before we move to the next topic. David, could you tell us a little bit more about what the PRI is doing in terms of looking at physical risk?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the real benefits of the PRI is that we've got this global network and this ability to sort of tap into experience and learning. And we certainly see part of our role is drawing upon that experience that people have and developing thought leadership pieces around it. We've got multiple staff working around physical risk and climate. And we're at the moment going through the process more deeply with our real estate and private equity signatory groups and with our teams that are working with them. And they're looking at where physical risk is most acute and what we're learning about how investors are approaching in their modelling engagement and security selection. So we expect to produce some papers coming out of that work later on in the year, which we'll be happy to share. And I think that will be a good reference point to see what the level of sophistication is around assessing climate physical risk amongst our signatories' experiences.
Thank you, David. So we started talking about that modeling piece, the looking into the data, digging in. Madison, I know you wrote a paper, I believe, on the challenges of modeling. You talked to it a little bit a while ago. Why are models so difficult?
Well, part of it is it's like the whole world and it's the whole economy and the temperature is changing, which changes everything. And that's simply really difficult to model. And it requires a lot of skills that not one person has. And I think fundamentally requires an interdisciplinary team, which we haven't really seen a lot of happening. A lot of engineers working with climate scientists, working with economists, working with ag people. And there really are different skill sets that you learn when you are someone who works with estimating dam failures versus someone who works as a top-down macroeconomist. And I still think that there's a lot of failures of interdisciplinarity that is a big challenge. I mean, there's one of my favorite things to do is to dunk on econ models of climate change. So I could say so many things. Maybe one thing to highlight is like on a really fundamental level, if you're simply using econometrics, we don't have data on what the economy looks like under climate change. We just don't have the data. So you can do a bunch of trend line analysis, but how much the economy has responded to 1.3 degrees of warming to now can really tell us a very limited amount about how the economy is going to respond from 1.3 to 2 and beyond, fundamentally because of the tipping points. And usually when people talk about tipping points, they're thinking of like the big scary ones, like the AMOC breaking down or the Amazon going up in flames. And those are certainly true, but there's actually like a lot of economic responses that are characterized by what I would call a tipping point, or certainly a nonlinearity, that we have to model in a different way using like that bottom up sources that we borrow from engineering and catastrophe models. We can't just do econometric trend line analysis. And that's where I think still some of the translation is really lagging about how to borrow the skills from, I think, primarily engineering, honestly, about how you would, what does the economy look like when all of the water in the Tibetan plateau disappears? Like econ models are not good at answering that question.
That's really helpful. Rob, I'm turning to you next, and you brought it up, so it's not my fault. But I know in the PRI reporting, we often ask, do you use climate scenario analysis? So putting reporting aside, how do you use models at Breckinridge?
The way we think of climate models, it's kind of built into, I guess it's an easier answer, but it's built into the research that we're sourcing from third parties. Risk or ICE uses particular, I think it's one representative comprehensive pathway, RCP. I think that's what they use. And then MSCI, we source climate data from MSCI. Our corporate analysis, our climate transition a little bit. They are using but so basically we don't do the modeling ourselves. We rely on outside sources for that, outside expertise.
That's helpful, thank you. And David, I know you talked about some upcoming papers that we have, but can you tell us a bit more about the forthcoming research with PRI and our friends at Ceres and around the largest investors in the US and how scenario analysis is used there?
I will, but I just want to support what Madison said just before about the fact that we're in an interesting place where from an investor's perspective, we're being asked to solve problems we've not been trained for. And I think this is one of the real challenges, but also one of the very exciting things about collaborations like this, because I think the role of academia has to play in creating the linkages between different domain expertise to help us break down the problem and have the right skill sets to help investors think about how we take this big macro problem and a systemic risk problem and put it into our models. And so then coming to scenario analysis, I mean, it has become a majority practice for our large asset owners and asset managers here in North America as they seek to quantify climate risk. But it is true to say that many don't disclose specific findings or note these disclosures in their modelling. And this is still an area that's developing. So it's not yet as decision useful as we would like it to be. And there's also widespread consensus that improved disclosure by investor companies will eventually make models more accurate. In addition to that, I mean, we're increasingly seeing, countries need to have their climate, they need to have their transition plans. We're increasingly seeing that now flow through into companies. It'll come into investors. Investors are going to need to have their own transition plans. And so scenario testing, your scenario models will, I think, become an important part. I think increasingly we're going to see them mandated in various jurisdictions. And what we can say is that that needs to happen so we start to get some more rigor and comparability, because, I mean, I have seen some data around the scenario testing, which says that, same scenario, One investor's saying it only has an implication of 1.5% return annual return difference compared to another where it's, I think it's 45%, right? So that's a big spectrum. So this is still an emerging area, but a really important one that I think we'll start to see some more discipline come in.
I have a little bit of bias with my quantitative friends. So great job for quants to kind of take on and tackle.
Absolutely.
Perhaps we shift to the next topic around passive investing. I know, Kimberly, you mentioned Warren Buffett and the rise of fundamental analysis again. Maybe I'll turn to Madison because I know you had some comments related to passive investing. Why does passive investing pose special challenges in this context?
So maybe I'll switch even and focus a little bit on the transition side, where I do think that we're moving into a new realm in which we're realizing that maybe scope emissions, for example, scope 1, 2, 3 emissions from the greenhouse gas protocol aren't always the best proxy for transition risk. And you actually have to be much more like sectorally specific and much more jurisdictionally specific, because how the transition is underway. How it will manifest actually will play out very differently in different countries and depending on the very specific sector. And up till now, a lot of the passive ESG strategies they're not really built for doing that like kind of fundamental level analysis of like, will this very particular heat pump contractor live or die, for example. They're much more interested in using metrics that can be applied broadly across an entire portfolio to do like tilting or weighting. And I think we're, especially as we like enter a realm of rapid transition where things are going to start changing more quickly and the shape of the economy will look very different than it looked in the past. I think passive investing has a potential to be at a disadvantage versus active investing, but that maybe there's actually ways we could improve and make better passive methods. But I still think it's early days on how to get the MSCIs of the world to be more transparent, to be more sophisticated, I would say, about how they're thinking about transition risk and how that then trickles down to the ESG passive funds.
Thanks, Madison. David, Kimberly, do you want to talk to any of the work that the PRI is doing with the passive work streams?
Yeah, I will always refer to you if you like.
No.
That's a big focus, right? It is because, Madison, as you point out in a lot of your work, right, many institutional investors have basically always thought, well, the developed markets are efficient, so the best way to invest there is passively, right? And I do agree with you. I hear a lot of investors saying, well, we're in a potentially at the dawn of a new golden age of fundamental investing, right? Like Aberdeen is one of the most interesting scenario analysis discussions that I've seen. And that's what they say is they think a broadly diversified portfolio potentially the net impact could be nothing, right, to the overall economy, but that within every sector, there are going to be huge winners and huge losers. And so that this is a time for, of course, their pitches and best for us, right? But, that this is a time for fundamental, all that information that has not been considered relevant. Now we all need to study that. But there's massive passive investing happening. So part of what PRI is involved in is the asset owners initiative. They've done a lot of work on this. All these are on their website, our website, very interesting about how the passive investors look at climate benchmarks and how the different, like the whole marketplace of what does it mean to be a Paris aligned or 1.5 degree aligned benchmark, what should that be? And also our net zero service providers alliance includes an index providers group. So both those, the asset owners and the index providers, are thinking a lot about this. What would it mean to have a passive benchmark that is doing what Madison is saying and being much more careful, not just some kind of quick, add-on, some kind of carbon emissions thing, but what would it mean to have something that's still representative of the economy, passive, but much more transitional aligned. So yeah, we don't have short answers yet, but there's a lot of.
I'm just going to add, Breckinridge, we certainly agree with the focus on being an active manager versus passive, and how doing that fundamental research is going to be really important going forward as far as determining the winners and losers on this transition.
So that, I think, Rob, I want to stick with you. I'll take you into the next one. We talked a little bit earlier about how there's no one way to do responsible investing or sustainable investing. And you mentioned that you're a net zero asset manager or a net zero aligned asset manager. Can you talk a little bit more broadly about what kind of targets you set as part of the NZAM initiative, and what does it really mean to you to commit to NZAM?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'd be happy to. And maybe I should give just a little bit of background too. So Breckinridge, I guess we first learned about the Net Zero Asset Managers Pledge in late 2021. I think that's when it was announced as part of COP in that year. It took us pretty much a year to sign on. There's a lot of decisions, a lot of discussions internally, a lot of consternation. Kind of touched on this earlier today, and a lot of debates internally about whether it did make sense to sign on to the pledge. Ultimately, we did because we believe that the economy is transitioning, and it will, and it's going to create a lot of major risks for certain companies that aren't being progressive in terms of transitioning. And so we set three commitments. We pledged to reduce the financed emissions intensity in our corporate bond holdings by 50% by 2030. And this we are tracking now. It took a lot of work internally to develop a process to calculate those finance emissions. And we're using the PCAF methodology, the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. That really a ton of work has been done by that initiative over the last few years. So we're calculating that now, and we are reporting it on this in the PRI assessment. We did last year. We will again now. That's where we are reporting as part of the NZAM pledge. The other one is that we committed to engage with 70% of our financed emissions in these corporate holdings every year, starting last year. That will ramp up to 90% by 2030. So basically, we're looking at the finance emissions by company. We have the list, and we're basically looking at the top ones, and it's essentially 12 companies. Some we talked to and engaged with already, but others we did not. And the idea is that we're going to talk to them and encourage them to transition if they're not already, or kind of applaud work that is happening. And then the third target is a portfolio alignment target, where as part of our corporate transition risk analysis, every analyst is labeling a company for their net zero alignment. We use the implementation guide, and there's 5 categories from aligning net zero to not committed to net zero. So we want the companies in our portfolios to be aligning or better by 2030 at 90%. Currently, it's 83%, which is a lot higher than we expected when we first calculated that measure. We expect that might drop as companies, they set net zero targets, they've pledged to cut emissions over time, and maybe they're not making progress that they should. So those are the 3 targets that we're managing to.
That's really helpful. And like I mentioned before, everyone is doing things in a little bit of a different way, and there's the flexibility to be able to do it in a way that's best considered or aligned with your objectives. David, perhaps maybe could you tell us a little bit more about how NZAM members as a whole are taking action?
Yeah. The first point to make, I think, is that there's a lot of learning going on at the moment. So I think we're at a really interesting period. People are trying things. Some things are working, some things aren't, and so there needs to be that recognition. But the most common method the NZAM members are using is to talk to their investee companies, engaging them and urging them to align their business models with net zero. And this is the key tool, because what we are invested in is in changing the real economy, not just cleaning up our portfolios while leaving the climate crisis untouched. And so divestment might be appropriate in certain circumstances when you've exhausted that process, but that whole trying to influence business models is a fundamental piece. NZAM members are also tracking decarbonisation by calculating the share of the company's emissions attributable to their investments, but this is typically one of a dashboard of metrics, since we know it's backward looking and doesn't tell the whole story. And they're also seeking opportunities to invest in climate finance and engage in policy advocacy to help create a level playing field in which climate impacts will be priced by the market. So sort of operating in a number of different levels. But I mean, it's a really important initiative and we're seeing some really great examples of leadership.
Thanks, David. And now you touched on something that I want to bring to Madison, policy regulation. Madison, from where you standpoint, particularly with your law background, what do policy makers, what do regulators need to do to get us to where we need to be?
I mean, so I know the question is definitely oriented to the financial world, but I think fundamentally we need like an Inflation Reduction Act too. I do believe that there's a limited amount that investors on their own can do without more guidance and regulation from the state on net zero emissions. So I guess I would say the Inflation Reduction Act in the US was a lot of carrots and no sticks, and the time really has come to start shutting down the fossil fuel production and demand. So I think we need much more aggressive bars on fossil fuels. So there's only so much you can do in terms of like incentivizing on the green side. We need to really start penalizing on the fossil side and just say like no more fossil fuel infrastructure, lots of retrofitting of homes. On the finance side, in the US, it's unfortunate that the judiciary is what it is at this moment. The Securities and Exchange Commission did make a lot of progress on its climate disclosure rule. That's now stayed because it's sitting awaiting hearing in the 8th Circuit, and we'll see what happens there. There are states moving along really swiftly. So in California and also New York, there's made a lot of progress on carbon reporting. I guess I would say I would be interested in seeing more regulation on the carbon offset market. I was a little bit disappointed that they weren't more aggressive in shutting down some of the most fraudulent bad actors in the voluntary carbon markets. I think offsets need to be like much more aggressively scrutinized. And we'll see what happens with the SEC greenwashing rule. More policing of like what it means to be an ESG fund and what it means to be a climate fund, I think would be helpful in this space from the regulators.
Just add a little bit to that from the PRI perspective. One of the major initiatives that we participate. Oh, I'm sorry. Hi, I just wanted to say a word on policy, right? Because every time we say fossil fuels, we can easily get misunderstood. So I always want to be really clear about what PRI does and our peers do on that issue. So we have been part of a number of NGOs that have worked on the global investor statement to companies, and that is we're gathering signatures on that for now, right now. And I just want to be really clear that the way we look at this is about pricing environmental risk. So the asks in there are about eliminating subsidies that distort the reality of the real economy, right? So they're not about we're pro this industry or we're anti that industry. We are like the absolute efficient marketeers, right? We're like, we want public policy that reflects the incredible cost, right? Like we just heard this in front of Congress a few weeks ago about $93 billion of climate damages every year, right? This is real money and it's real impact. And so everything in the global investor statement is saying we're investors. As Madison said, there's only so much we can do on our own. But we want a market where the damage that is occurring is priced. So we don't want subsidies that right now are distorting that and preventing that from showing up in securities prices, right? And we want a tax structure and all of these things that reflect reality, right? But we are not like, for any other reason, pro or anti any sort of industry. I just want to be really clear about that. We're clear about we want efficient pricing of what's actually happening in the world.
Can I touch on something Kimberly just said too? When you talked about climate risk not being priced in the market, I wanted to mention just really briefly, Breckinridge, an analyst on our team, Erica Small, wrote a paper as part of her PhD program that she just finished up at Duke University, and now she's an analyst here at Breckinridge. And I just wanted to highlight, so she wrote that paper in conjunction with Breckinridge, noting, we noted that the municipal bond market is on the front lines of the climate crisis, wanted a better understanding of how the market is responding to new climate data and climate risk understanding. basically the conclusion from that paper and something that we're seeing is that there's no pricing of physical climate risk in the municipal bond market. So we kind of comparing communities that are living in high physical risk versus low physical risk as measured by the risk ICE data, saw that really from a pricing differential, bonds with higher climate risk only have 4 basis points wider bond spreads for 32 times increase in insurance equivalence financial risk from climate hazards. So only 4 basis points higher for 32 times higher climate risk. So when you're talking about that, and that's certainly what we're seeing, there's a lot of demand for muni bonds from investors, but climate is not being priced in. And just the last point I just wanted to mention too is that Municipal Market Analytics, MMA, based in Massachusetts here, follows the municipal bond market very closely, does a lot of great research just on the muni bond market. Noted in a recent piece, this is in April, that state and local governments, historically reluctant to increase debt balances, seem likely to pivot in the coming years, really due to climate change. And they think that municipal bond issuance could double in the next 10 years. We're not sure if that's the case, but they say that climate-related borrowing could rise substantially due to climate adaptation projects, encountering higher recurring spending for disaster recovery, and then also managing transition risk. So I had those notes here, and when you mentioned that it's not being priced, I just wanted to highlight that as well.
Thank you. Those are great examples.
Thank you. So something I heard earlier today, more information allows for better decisions, allows for better investments. Perhaps before we close up for the afternoon, I might give a chance for each one of the panelists to provide any closing remarks or takeaway comment that you'd like us to go with.
Yeah, I can start. Madison, you mentioned the voluntary carbon market. I do find that market really fascinating. I know there's lots of concerns with it, but it's something that we're following in terms of understanding how companies may be using carbon credits to manage their carbon footprint. And so I do find it interesting that the Science-Based Targets Initiative looks like it might be loosening up on rules in terms of the use of carbon credits by companies to manage their Scope 3 emissions. I think that might be a positive over time, personally, as long as those credits are credible and deemed to be high quality. Because as time goes by, as emissions keep rising, I think companies are going to need other tools to kind of manage their footprint.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say, so in terms of climate scenario analysis, I would really recommend people check out a series of reports that's been put out by the University of Exeter in collaboration with some institutional investors, including private equity and also pension funds. One is called The Emperor's New Climate Scenarios. I just think that people need to get real about really how bad it's going to be, the economic devastation that it is now baked in. And I don't see the investment world or the financial regulatory world facing that reality at all, at all. And so I would recommend reading those reports, trying to hire different skill sets onto your teams, including climate scientists. And it's just at the very beginning. And as Kimberly said, Warren Buffett saying, oh, all the utilities might have to be owned by the government. You're seeing similar, very weak, very scary moves in the insurance market about is there going to be home insurance in America in a whole bunch of different states, in Texas and Iowa, not just California and Florida? So I think that people need to wake up a little bit and really read the science, because it doesn't look good.
So just to say that the investment community in finance has a very important role to play in our ability to make the transition, but it cannot do it on its own. And I mean, it's interesting, just sort of over the last 15 years, in a way, the sort of investment community was off to the side, and it was governments just, with their, through the COPs and the various policies, were ignoring the role of the finance sector. Then it suddenly switched 180%, and it was sort of like the finance sector has to solve everything. Now, that is just unrealistic dreamland stuff. However, it is absolutely correct to say that from from the way the PRI sees it, our role is to support our individual signatories to become better responsible investors. But if you believe the thematic, you know you can't solve these systemic risk issues on your own. So we provide opportunities for signatories to come together and work on collaborative efforts to address climate risks. But even with those two things happening, we need to have the right policy enabling environment to enable sustainable finance to get to work and play its part. We cannot scale up and leverage up without having the public and the private frameworks speaking to each other. And the last point that I make, and apologies, Max, because you heard this story earlier today, but just sort of how this is going from a sort of a macro a governmental perspective. Last year, we had our conference, our annual conference, which is the largest responsible investment conference in Japan. And the Japanese government lent in to our conference because they had they wanted to reboot their sustainable finance credentials to institutional investors. So they made substantive policy announcements at our conference and through the weeks that we were there. And then we were invited to a Prime Minister's roundtable. And one of our policy positions is that there needs to be a whole of government response. And the Prime Minister chaired this meeting, and he had all of the ministers on one side. He had all of the hard to abate sector leaders, transport, chemicals, agriculture. On the other side, he had international players like that, and he had the media in the room. And he asked each of the individual hard to abate sector leaders get up and explain how they were going to use innovation to transition to net zero for their industries. But how what they were struggling with, which was the lack of capital, but with the right policy enabling environment, they believed that they would be able to accelerate their progression to net zero. And I think what was really interesting about that is they were making a pitch to international sustainable finance, come and invest in our transition. And I think increasingly we're going to see the smart governments position themselves in this way. Capital is global. It will go to the places, sustainable capital will go to the places it believes it can get the best returns and address these systemic risk issues. So I think we're going to see this increasingly race to the top for those who are smart enough to understand that there is capital there. If you create the right enabling environment, it will get to work.
All right, I'll just say the very last thing. I agree with all of that. It's been said many, many times. We have a very serious crisis, but we also have everything we need to fix it. And that really is true. But what we need more of is more talking, thinking, more and more people involved in this. So I'm just grateful for everybody that comes on a beautiful summer afternoon, that you came, that you're here online. And that's how we're going to do it, is more and more people thinking, talking, staying together. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Kimberly. You stole the words right out of my mouth. I just want to say thank you so much to our panelists for sharing your perspective, your expertise. Thank you to BU IMAP, Susan, Deborah, and team. Fantastic opportunity. Really excited about the work that you're doing here and the forums that you're creating. For those of you here, stay with us. Thanks for coming. Ask your questions after. For those online, thanks for joining today. We really appreciate it. As Kimberly mentioned, it's a giant problem. We all come with our different expertise. We got to work this together to solve it. Thank you again.